Welcome to the New Gravity Housing Conference session, Shaping Affordable Housing Communities of the Future. I'd like to remind all attendees that everyone is muted with their videos off, and please utilize the Q&A feature in Zoom throughout the session to share your questions with our presenters. We'll be monitoring the Q&A throughout the session, and we'll also have a facilitated Q&A at the end. Please use the chat feature in Zoom for side and general discussion. We'd also like to take some time to thank our sponsors for their generous support of this year's conference. Please make sure to check them out in the virtual expo hall. Now here's a brief message from our sponsor, Swagon, before we get started with this session. Chat feature in Zoom.
The Gold RX air handling unit with a rotary heat exchanger has a unique way of securing the indoor air quality. The rotary heat exchanger is excellent at transferring energy from one airstream to another. But there is a risk of extract air leaking over into the clean supply air. To avoid this, Gold is equipped with a purging sector. But if the airflow is reduced, the purging sector may be insufficient. To solve this, Gold matches the rotor speed to the airflow, slowing down the rotor if necessary. Thanks to this unique solution, Gold delivers great supply air quality, even for demand-controlled ventilation.
Thank you again to Swagon and all of our New Gravity sponsors for their support. Now let's get into the session. I'd like to introduce our speakers for this session. We have Angelina Benson-Glanz, the Director of New Market Initiatives at Elevate Energy, Maria Quiñones, Senior Project Manager at Elevate Energy, Lauren Westmoreland, Policy Program Director Initiatives at Enterprise Community Partners, and Nella Young, Senior Program Director Initiatives at Enterprise Community Partners. Here are the learning objectives for this session, and as a reminder, the New Gravity Housing Conference is approved for FIAS, PHI, AIA, and GPCI credit. Thank you all again for joining us, and don't forget to use that Q&A feature throughout the session to ask the presenters your questions. Now I'm going to hand it over to our speakers to get started.
Thank you all for being here with us. Let's get started. The title of our presentation is called Shaping Affordable Housing Communities of the Future. What you see on the screen now is just a quick session description. The global pandemic has undoubtedly significantly impacted the affordable housing community. And the question that we wanted to answer is, what have we learned from this health crisis that will help preserve and create resilient affordable housing? The goal of the session is twofold. The first is to reflect on the lessons learned from the impacts of the global health crisis or the pandemic on the affordable housing community. And the second is to transform these lessons into practical solutions that strengthen our affordable housing communities. My name is Maria Quiñones, and I will be your moderator for today. I'm actually based in Chicago and work at Elevate Energy. We're a national nonprofit. We design and implement programs that reduce costs, protect people and the environment, and ensure the benefits of clean and efficient energy use reach those who need them most. Today's session will be a panel format. I have 3 panelists with me, and we'll essentially be having a conversation with a few visuals as a backdrop. I'd like if each of the panelists were to introduce themselves and answer one question. Let's just kind of get started. What is your vision for an irresistible future for affordable housing? Angelina, do you want to kick it off?
Thanks, Maria. Hi, everyone. My name is Angelina Benson-Glanz, and I'm the Director of New Market Initiatives at Elevate Energy. I'm based in Oakland, California, where I lead our West Coast partners, programs and partnerships. And I also manage our engagements with national affordable housing portfolios and the delivery of our high-performance building services. Through our programs and services, we strive to create healthy, thriving communities, particularly for those who are vulnerable to the impacts of health, economic, and climate inequities. And so, Maria, to your question, in my irresistible future, we as a society have invested in communities that have been historically left behind or forgotten, so that the residents of those communities now have high quality housing, schools, jobs, and healthcare, because so much of a person's life outcomes are dependent on the zip code they come from. Lauren?
Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Westmoreland. I am a policy program director for Enterprise Community Partners. We are a national nonprofit providing financing, policy, and programs for the affordable housing sector. I'm really excited to be here today. I collaborate with our Green Communities team and 11 market offices of enterprises, as well as our Rural Native American Initiative, to align our national agenda with state, regional, and local policy needs. I develop and execute the Enterprise Green Communities policy agenda to advance the adoption of green affordable housing practices across the country. However, we all know that policy work cannot be done alone and is certainly not limited to one organization. So I work with stakeholders around the country in order to make that happen. And my irresistible future would be where communities fight to preserve, upgrade, and build new affordable housing, where there's competition for that housing to exist in your community, where we see the value of those affordable housing communities and their individual residents. And now I'll hand it off to Nella.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm Nella Young. I am a senior program director also at Enterprise Community Partners on our national initiatives team. And I lead our cultural resilience program, which explores the intersection of culture, healing, and resilience in housing and community development. So this means that my team and I facilitate partnerships between local community development corporations and artists and designers like performing artists, visual artists, architects, cultural organizers, other creative practitioners, with the goal being to really influence the community development process and projects so that they're more grounded in residents' priorities, so that they are celebrating local culture and facilitating healing, because all of this contributes to community resilience. And in my irresistible future, residents of affordable housing are the authors of their own destiny, and that is something that our professions are organized and incentivized to support.
Thank you all for your introductions and your answers on what an irresistible future looks like. Before diving deeper into the discussion and asking more questions to the panelists, I'd like to briefly talk about what we do know about the impacts of the pandemic thus far on the affordable housing communities, the communities that we serve. It's difficult to think about the challenges facing affordable housing and not think about the race disparities that have been emphasized as a result of this pandemic. Many of us have probably seen this article or are familiar with this article from the New York Times. By the way, the New York Times had to sue the CDC to confirm these statistics. But this piece essentially quantifies the racial inequities of coronavirus. In this piece, the New York Times confirmed that Black and brown people are 3 times as likely to be infected with coronavirus and twice as likely to die compared to white folks. There are many reasons for this, as we know, most of which are a result of centuries of structural and institutional racism, but 2 specific reasons stand out. The first is Black and brown people represent the majority of essential workers, or the essential workforce. We know that to be true. The second is that Black and brown people have historically, and still to today, continue to experience long-term exposure to air pollution. This increases the likelihood and complications such as asthma and also the death rates related to COVID-19. This graphic was taken from a presentation given by Professor Shalonda H. Baker. She's the co-founder and co-director of Initiative for Energy Justice. I wanted to show this slide because it really illustrates that Black and brown people are exposed to far more pollution than we produce. So when we're talking about air pollution and the correlation with COVID, it is just pretty daunting, the statistics that we see here. Many people in this demographic live in low-income households who spend a third to half of their incomes on housing and are at risk of losing their homes to eviction or foreclosure. In this next slide, the figure to the left shows renters, or a statistic by Apartment List, showing renters are more concerned than homeowners about losing housing. The article on the right discusses how mass evictions, which are anticipated after statewide moratoriums expire, are expected to exacerbate homelessness and housing inequity. And before, I guess, just to kind of end this, I want to share with the audience that something that came up in preparing for this session. One of the things that we talked about was our role as experts in our field. And there's one thing that I think we all agreed on. We don't have the solutions to the challenges facing affordable housing and the people most affected. So I'll pose the following question to the panel. What is actually our role as experts? Nella, do you want to kick this off?
Maria, yeah, this has really raised that question for us about how do we define expertise and how do we use the privilege and resources that we have as a national intermediary to support the real experts who are community members in the places where we're designing and building housing. So really speaking from that point of view of someone working in a national nonprofit, as a highly educated professional, we're often feeling like we have to have the answers and the solutions. And we, in fact, however, are in a position to listen to what people want to see in their communities and then apply our expertise in figuring out how to make that happen. So we can provide resources, we can provide technical expertise. We have a lot of paid staff who can spend time helping to implement those priorities. And in my mind, I really would love to see that the future of affordable housing is tapping into that human-centered, client-centered mentality that as professionals, we are really able to shift our focus from having expertise and answers and solutions to being about using our expertise to support implementation of the solutions coming from the local experts.
Angelina, do you want to add to that?
I do. Thanks, Moran. Thanks, Nella. At Elevate, we really do see much of our role as amplifying the voices and the needs of grassroots and community-based organizations on the ground, and really trying to get those resources to communities to address the needs that they've identified. And just want to give you a couple examples. At the start of the pandemic, we did quickly mobilize to engage our funders and apply for grants so that we could flow the grant funding down to community relief efforts. And just a few of those examples, we provided funds to affordable housing providers so that they could distribute the funding to the residents and enable the residents to make that decision of whether they use the funds to pay rent. We also worked with those same housing providers to get groceries to seniors, utilizing grocery delivery services. We felt that seniors who are just heavily impacted and then high risk and often don't have access to safe transportation in light of the pandemic, we really wanted to make sure that they had access to food. And then, just a third example was that we really worked with key community-based organizations in Chicago to purchase and distribute water to families and households whose water had been shut off. And sometimes in cases the water had been shut off for years due to a few missed payments. And at a time where hand washing and access to clean water is so incredibly critical during this pandemic, in order to stay healthy, we found that this was a huge need in the community, and we were able to help fill the gap. And again, really important at a time where water utility was unable to reconnect households in a timely manner. So that's some of the things that we've been doing and some of the role that we've played. Lauren, do you want to elaborate on that from a policy?
Yeah. Thank you to you both for sharing that. Yes, I'm absolutely in agreement with what you've both shared so far. And, it's been really impressive how there's been a lot of folks in the community on the ground doing everything from what Elevate is doing to what we've heard regarding mutual aid. From a policy perspective, it is going to be really important to elevate all of these stories from the ground up, continuing to push for these solutions that we know are working on the ground and figure out how to bring them to policy. A lot of our systems did make some, shifts, such as utility shut-off moratoriums, what we saw with some cities putting homeless folks in hotel rooms. We know that these things now can happen, and I think that we need to continue sharing the stories that we're hearing from those experts on the ground to continue to push for what we know is needed, both from a services standpoint as well as a physical building standpoint. One thing we know is that the systems we've relied on in the past, the policies that are in the past, they are not designed for this pandemic, nor I think what we should be looking for in the future.
Thank you. I'd like to move us on to our next question. Let me move this slide forward. So previously, our industry generally thought about resilience from a buildings perspective. I think, the panelists, myself here, and maybe some of the attendees today, we thought about resiliency or resilience as a way to protect our physical infrastructure against the stressors and shocks of climate change. However, this pandemic has shown us that we need to expand our thinking of what resiliency really means to us. And I'd like to pose a question to the panelists. What is your definition of resiliency? Lauren, do you want to answer that first?
Yeah, thanks, Maria. It's a great question. I'd love to kick that off. Yeah, there's been a distinct shift from pre-COVID. Pre-COVID, when you looked at the policy sector, state and local governments had offices that focused on resiliency from the climate perspective. We talked about how to ensure buildings stood up during and after a disaster. And if we did talk about the resiliency of individuals, it really was from the perspective of what I've seen defined as toxic resiliency. Meaning we're asking individuals to live within a broken system or within broken buildings in the case of, what we're looking at, and continue to survive and go around those issues. That's some of what we saw previously. What we're seeing now is, we're shifting from sort of the disaster preparedness standpoint of how we view what we would need to leave the building to moving into what does it mean when we have to stay in the building and how does resiliency look different? Nella, what does resiliency mean to you?
Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, I think about this when we were developing our cultural resilience initiative. We were really worried about this concept of resilience being both important to address in affordable housing, but also defined around buildings and climate change. And that if we continued to keep that frame, we would be missing the whole story. So because we know so many of the stresses in people's lives are not limited to flooding or heat waves or storms. So this one particular body of research was really helpful from a professor at Northeastern University. His name is Daniel Aldrich, and he's shown that when disasters strikes, survival rates are directly correlated not to how well designed and constructed the buildings or stormwater systems, seawalls, other kinds of physical infrastructure is, but really to how much people trust their neighbors and their local institutions. And this is basically social cohesion. And it's one of the most clear measures of resilience. And it is actually what saves people's lives. So our cultural resilience program was founded on this question: what would it look like if you're investing in infrastructure for climate resilience? And then you also invested in social cohesion. And so we partnered with several groups and gave them grants and brought them together and talked to them and learned from their projects. And one of the things we talked about was this question of view of what resilience means. And we had people talking about intergenerational trauma, racism, ICE raids on their immigrant populations, unemployment, all these kinds of that they had to be resilient to. And this expectation, like you talked about, Lauren, of this toxic resilience concept, this expectation that we're relying on our most vulnerable people to constantly respond and survive in the face of all of these disasters and stresses. So we were really trying to identify ways that centering culture and healing, which we've seen, culture is a fundamental survival strategy over centuries. And how can culture and healing be part of what we invest in when we're building resilience? And that is going to be meaningful, whether you're looking at resilience in terms of flooding or in terms of a pandemic. So if you're building that foundation of connection and social cohesion and centering culture and healing in your processes, then when you have a pandemic like COVID or other kinds of stressors, in addition to climate-related stressors, you have some foundation to build upon. And one of the things we've been asking ourselves a lot now is, how do we keep investing in community engagement? How do we keep investing in social cohesion when we are required to be socially distant? And that means also that not everyone is going to have access to the same levels of technology. So we've learned a lot from people around the country who are managing affordable housing and also working in community engagement and working at the city level, as well as grassroots organizers, but using text messaging tools and trying to also use spaces that people walk by and can interact with over time, outdoors ideally, like parks, and also in some communities they have little libraries or there are storefront windows, and really basic things like how important the phone has become, not for all of the other technology uses, but actually a phone call has become really one of the tools people are going to, having a phone tree where residents are checking in on each other. And also, like Angelina talked about, really simple things like how housing providers are providing something like a weekly grocery delivery can really do multiple duty. So they can be providing access to healthy food, limiting exposure to being in a busy store, and at the same time also be a well-being check-in opportunity. So these are all kind of things that we've been seeing happening that sort of been emerged during the pandemic and the social distancing requirement. Angelina, would love to hear what you're thinking about in terms of building operations and air quality, and some of the things that you also think about in your work context.
Thanks, Nella. You know, it's this pandemic has really highlighted the importance of sheltering in place or staying at home, avoiding group settings, you know, and that can even mean, you know, in normal disasters, you would go spend time with a relative. Well, now in the pandemic, that relative may be medically very sensitive or vulnerable. And so we're spending more time in our homes. But we have to think about how can we, one, make our homes safer physically, and then how can we also keep people in their homes financially? So it's kind of two different levels that I think of resiliency in terms of from a physical health and safety standpoint. You know, we're really talking more about indoor air quality. It's absolutely critical. We're thinking about ventilation, so that's including access to fresh air, how many air changes per hour. We're trying to utilize higher MERV rating filters, HEPA filters, UV light to destroy the aerosolized virus particles. So we're really thinking a lot about indoor air quality. And then extending that, is there a way to expedite electrification of combustion appliances, you know, to really eliminate those VOCs that can exacerbate respiratory conditions and such as asthma and make folks more vulnerable and higher risk. to COVID-19. Also thinking a lot more about clean water, which is so critical to hand washing, as I mentioned before. Can we add no-touch sensors to water fixtures? So there's a lot we're thinking about, in addition to, of course, just regular safe cleaning practices, particularly in the common areas of our affordable housing properties that we work so closely with. So that's from a physical health and safety standpoint. But again, how do we keep people in their homes? From a financial standpoint, even prior to the pandemic, a third of U.S. families didn't have even $250 in savings, according to an Urban Institute 2016 study. And that study found that families with a savings cushion of $250 to $750 were less likely to be evicted, miss a housing or utility payment, receive public benefits after a job loss or health issue or a large income drop. So now more than ever, we're seeing the devastating impact that a sudden job loss or illness can have on people's ability to stay in their homes financially. And so at Elevate, we partnered with two nonprofit affordable housing providers in Chicago, as well as the Urban Institute, to assist residents in their buildings by really helping them to build a small amount of savings, with the goal of helping them become more financially secure and avoid housing instability over the long term. While this was something that we started prior to the pandemic, we have been able to check in with the families, and it has been helpful to them during the course of this pandemic. So it's just a really interesting aspect. There's multiple levels to resiliency. And I think, as Maria touched on, this pandemic has disproportionately impacted Black and Latinx communities because so many are essential workers or low-wage workers that have been laid off and don't have access to good paying jobs with benefits such as paid leave. So we're also working to increase access to good paying jobs in the clean energy sector. We're supporting small diverse contractor businesses through a contractor accelerator. And that's been really critical during this pandemic, because we've been able to check in with those contractors to see if they've been able to apply for the Paycheck Protection Program, or if they haven't, then we've actually been able to give out some forgivable loans. So just a couple different levels and ways we're thinking about all of this, and specifically resiliency.
Sounds like Elevate Energy does really cool work, Angelina. But to talk about enterprise's really cool work, I want to go back to this concept of social cohesion, Nella. What have we learned about the need for or lack of social cohesion, and how has that been fostered or inhibited in affordable housing, from both the spatial sense of the word or the process sense of the word?
Thanks, Maria. I feel like I have so many thoughts on this topic. We could have an entire hour-long discussion on it, but a couple things to say, and then an example I can share. So first of all, in my experience, this emphasis on both the spatial and the process is really important. Place is a really, really important and essential asset. The places that we design and build can, of course, like Angelina talked about, contribute to health. They can save people money, but they can also enable stronger bonds. They can facilitate trust building and human networks by increasing the likelihood of social interactions in the common spaces and in the flow of the spatial layout, as well as framing a positive narrative about the identity of a community. So with COVID, the places many of us are spending so much time in are really essential to our safety and our health and well-being, and how well they are designed to facilitate connections and a sense of home is playing out also in the kinds of relationships people have with neighbors and with the professionals involved in managing their properties. And the foundation for all of that quality of connections is the process. Trust, of course, takes time to build. It needs ongoing reinforcement. And just as a lot of the temporary solutions that we're seeing now in the housing sector could become permanent, the ways in which we're communicating and responding in this current moment will matter to the long-term well-being of our communities. So I thought one example, and it's an example from before COVID hit, but I love to talk about American Indian Housing Organization, ACO, American Indian Community Housing Organization. They have, and you're seeing an image here from their project in Duluth where they're based. They have a building with 29 units of permanent supportive housing using the Housing First model. It's also connected to a cultural center and an art gallery and shop in the ground floor of the building, as well as a childcare space. They have a lot going on there. But this one's interesting because it really talks about both the spatial and the process. So the Native community there is actually a portion of the population of Duluth, but a very large portion of the homeless population. So the image that many of the general population have and the attitude is not necessarily a positive one towards many of the Native community members. And this building that you can see here is very visible when you enter town. It really acts like a billboard when you drive in off the highway. And it created this amazing opportunity, really, to increase the visibility of the Native community in a positive way. So ACO convened an advisory committee of local residents and cultural advisors. And part of what they did was to select a muralist for this wall. And this is the first public artwork in the city that represents a Native community member or the Native community, and was created by a Native artist, which was a real source of pride for the organization and a lot of the people involved. And in addition to using their space and this process to build positive associations with the community, they've also, at the same time, had a lot of climate-related challenges. So they had a lot of extended power outages during winter storms, and they've wanted to provide a resilience hub during those times so people can come plug in, get warm, get food. And so they did this solar installation on the roof to enable that consistency so that they can operate and have power even when the grid is down. And then next to the rooftop, next to this solar array and mural, you can't see it, but there's a rooftop deck and a garden, and they were hosting a lot of environmental education seminars, drumming circles, all kinds of activities open to residents and the public. And now all of that investment is really translating. So when everyone's required to distance from each other, there are all these connections to build on and a lot of trust already in place. And so, especially for people who've been systemically put at a disadvantage by our societal structures, responding as a provider in a way that is caring and attentive is going to build trust. And that is an investment in our readiness for the next challenge, which we don't know what it will be, but we know there will be one.
Thanks, Nella. That was, every time you tell that story about that project, it's just amazing how they were able to so thoughtfully put so many things together in one package that really addressed the issues that the community brought up, as well as the issues facing those who would be living in the building. So I just want to touch a little bit on policy and sort of thinking about the things before we even get to the site, perhaps. It's a delicate balance from the regulated affordable housing side. Anytime you're distributing funds, the housing finance agencies are trying to balance things like access to opportunity, like great schools, and that may be at odds with where there's access to transit, or where perhaps residents may feel comfortable because they already have community there. There's 2 affordable housing projects in Atlanta that I can think of. One is literally around the corner from me. It's a renovated old hotel. It's been converted into senior housing, and it's in this amazing location, really close to transit. There's a Publix right across the street, library a block away. It's really great as far as location goes, but at the same time, because the building, the way was the way it was and perhaps the programming cannot be there, there have been some slight discord between the community and that building, because in a building that houses both elderly and perhaps disabled folks, there's been some question of who should be there, who should be out on the sidewalk, what time, that type of stuff. And then you sort of counter that with an affordable housing project that's over on the west side of Atlanta, that too housing senior and disabled folks. And it's in a community that's mostly Black, people of color, and people are out on the sidewalks all the time. It's not a problem. But it's just it's a different sort of thing, because then they don't have access to the transit. They're essentially within a food desert. So it's this delicate balance of thinking about how we create social cohesion and what sort of social cohesion we're talking about, and what that looks like. With that said, I think that green building and well-designed spaces within the project's boundaries can happen no matter what. And I think that that's something that we should be pushing for, not only from the policy standpoint through our affordable housing mechanisms, but also from the standpoint of how we look at our green building programs. Are all green building programs creating criteria and other opportunities to create social cohesion? I think that's something that we could look closer at, and how we can push that forward. And I'll hand it off to you, Angelina. I'd love to hear what you think.
Thank you, guys. I've just learned so much, even in just listening to you. And as both Nella and Lauren have said, I think it's really incumbent upon us as implementers and practitioners. I think about what I do from a day-to-day working with affordable housing providers, and we have to make sure that when we're designing and rehabbing buildings and just thinking about energy efficiency, water efficiency, location, all of it, indoor air quality, everything we've talked about today, we have to keep social cohesion and creating a sense of community at the forefront of our minds and of the designs and the rehab. So ultimately, we have to remember community matters, and we are creating homes for people, and homes that we want them to be able to stay in for the long term. So I've learned so much, and it's been a very thought-provoking discussion for me. And my key takeaway is communities matter, and communities know how best to support each other. So let's find ways to make sure that we're designing our buildings and doing more to foster that.
Thank you all. Yeah, agreed. People first. And I think that is the lesson learned, right? Maybe we have gotten away from people in many ways in our industry, and it's time to kind of bring it back. So I'd like to end this presentation, the presentation portion of this session, by thanking all of you, Nella, Lauren, Angelina, for partaking in this really thought-provoking discussion. I also learned a lot. Thank you. As we shift over to the Q&A portion, and as we wait for comments and questions to come in through the chat box, I'd like to pose a final question to the panelists and also to the audience. Please, chime in. My question is, what are the essentials that we didn't prioritize before?
As everyone kind of turns on their video and unmutes themselves, and just want to remind the attendees here, please answer the question if you have any thoughts. What are the essentials that we didn't prioritize before? But actually, let me rephrase. I think the question is better put, what are the essentials that we didn't prioritize before as a society, as a collective? Maybe Angelina, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, thanks, Maria. I would love to. I think I touched on a lot of this earlier. I think from a technical side, we know we spend roughly 90% of our time in buildings, but the pandemic is really bringing indoor air quality to the front and center of many conversations where it wasn't before. I think in these conversations, we're also talking more about internet access as being more critical. And then, of course, on the financial or economic side of things, now more than ever, we're seeing a need to really invest in training a diverse workforce around the clean energy economy and clean energy jobs. So, Lauren, do you want to answer next?
Yeah, I just want to double down on that. I think that, you know, I was thinking back to my children go to a daycare, and we opened again recently, and parents are asking about indoor air quality, and that's just like unprecedented. Normally you would not have that sort of situation occurring. So it's interesting, these things that I think we weren't necessarily able to prioritize before, but we've been thinking about for a long time, are coming up to the surface in ways that we didn't expect or anticipate. And I don't want to say you want to take advantage of a terrible situation, but I mean, I think this is an opportunity for us to elevate things that we know are vital. And I think that we have the attention of folks in a way that we didn't previously. But Nella, I'd be really curious to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that I feel like has really become clear is just how important it is to know your neighbors. The fabric of communities and neighborhood is so noticeable and makes such a difference. And we are really having an opportunity to notice that, given how much time we are spending at home and hopefully a little bit outdoors and with the people who live around us. So I feel like it makes such a huge difference, right? If you're connected with the people around you, and also it makes a huge difference if you're not. That kind of isolation has such a huge impact. And I feel like then that's a foundation also for some of the really interesting organizing and networks that we've seen, where communities and neighbors, sometimes geographically, or often geographically, but also, you know, other reasons for connecting, like, you know, through faith groups and things like that. But seeing how much mutual aid has become much more of an active new way that people are finding ways to support each other and also to give what they have to offer. So I find that has been a really inspiring sense of possibility, and something that wasn't necessarily prioritized or organized in the same way before. And I find that's a really interesting aspect emerging.
Thank you. I'd like to add Catherine's comment. Catherine Elmore said, the financial risk of not addressing resiliency are continuously shifted down the line to the end of the economic food chain. The macrofinance community understands these risks in many cases, but there isn't enough effort to spread around the upfront cost of investing in resiliency across sectors. And Catherine did bring up just through the presentation a lot of comments around resiliency and toxic resiliency. And I was wondering if either Nella, Lauren, perhaps Angelina, if you want to expand on that and what that really means to you.
I can start. Yeah, you know, it is something in working in the policy field, we're constantly butting up against first costs, and the impact of first cost and the potential of not meeting the quantity perception because we have to focus on the quality perception. And I think that that's difficult because no one wants that race to the bottom. So, you know, it is one of those things where we're sort of constantly balancing that. But, you know, I think it's a battle worth fighting. And I think that we're hearing a lot of good questions and comments from those who are in the regulatory sector, asking things like, how do we ensure our residents stay healthy? Because, you know, we are faced with a situation where everyone needs to stay inside, and they're really recognizing like the impact that quality has on affordable housing and just housing in general.
Yeah, one of the things I've also been thinking about is, you know, ownership, and there are people on this call and in our field are kind of doing really different kinds of work a lot of the time, but there are many in many ways, we all have an opportunity to ask, how could the work that we're doing in partnership with communities build ownership, be part of building economic well-being too, because it's such a huge component of resilience that often isn't understood when we talk about resilience as what we're focusing on. But really, you know, as we've seen, and as Angelina was talking about, when so many of our essential workers are having both these tight financial situations and health impacts, again, like this is the toxic resilience that we're talking about, where communities who are vulnerable are constantly being asked to respond with such like limited support systems around them. And so I think asking how can, you know, if you're in alternative energy, how can that be about reducing costs and building equity for low-income people? And that question can be asked across a lot of different kinds of areas of expertise or specialty.
Yeah, I think that's what we're starting to do more of that at Elevate, which I'm really excited about. We're really drawing the connections between, you know, the building science, energy efficiency, and financial, you know, honestly, wealth building and wealth, you know, well-being. So I'm excited about that, and I'm glad that we're able to have this conversation with other, you know, green building and professionals and building science experts, because we do need to prioritize this more.
Drew Levine, I believe that's how you spell or pronounce your name, was responding to the question of what essentials should we continue to prioritize moving forward as a society. And his response was, I feel that what we have not prioritized is putting value on creating places which celebrate life and make us better, and not just valuing efficiency, parentheses, of construction, energy use, etc. One of the most important parts of individual resilience during the past 6 months has been connection to nature. Biophilia keeps us going when the world around us does not. Couldn't agree more. While I'm looking at the chat box, I also want to point out to all of the attendees that Nella has provided links to a couple of resources, including the Native American mural and resilience project she discussed a little bit ago, as well as some additional case studies. She also included a link to the cultural resilience criterion and process guides for the 2020 Green Communities criteria, which some might find really helpful.
I'll add that the Made to Last book, which is case studies from our climate and cultural resilience grantees, also put some framing around the concept of cultural resilience and the role of arts and culture in that overall concept. And the groups that participated in that really helped us, along with a few other colleagues across the country, helped us as an advisory group to develop the cultural resilience criterion for the Green Communities update, which has just recently launched this year. And so when you read the cultural resilience criterion, a lot of it reflects the experiences that those case studies actually went through, and then some of the insight yielded that people felt could be offered to others across the country to use. So there's like continuum and a journey of partnership and learning that these resources I've shared is reflecting.
Yeah, and I actually want to put this back onto all of the attendees a little bit too. So as Nella mentioned, case studies, like the storytelling aspect, like I totally agree with Drew, like the connection to nature is very important. But how do we tell that story? And how do we make that resonate from a policy perspective? I don't want to say we have it down with energy per se, but like there's a way to measure it and to then sort of distribute that story to the property owner, to the developer, to the residents, to the broader community. But how do we do this with some of the other parts of green building out there? Because the story is everything. You know, you see the stories about both positive and negative of people impacted by their housing. And that's like what's resonating with policymakers at this time.
think those stories will really resonate with more affordable housing owners too. So I think that the ones that are pursuing enterprise green communities and going after those, really trying to achieve the criterion that you sent out, Nella, that's awesome. But there's still, I'm having conversations every day where I have to convince an affordable housing owner to do something, and they just care about the bottom line. So how do we, I would love to be armed with even more resources to be able to tell that story and show them that it's of utmost value.
I'm looking at my wall because I was listening to someone else talk about something like that, and also a sort of how to not have to convince people of things is the most powerful way to convince people. And the quote on my wall is, listening is actually a really active thing to do. And I think understanding where people's struggles are and where they're coming from, and almost just having these conversations where people can kind of explore and then their mental barriers or their challenges, and then find a way past, and also relate to, I think one of the reasons that Lauren is always talking about the importance of stories is that regardless of your position or your beliefs, people can relate to stories, and often stories, these personal stories, remove a lot of the like political or like conceptual frames that people kind of associate with being in a position or being on a side. And it kind of removes that element more, and people can then respond with a little bit more empathy and understanding. And also, I think it moves people in a different way.
Yeah, we got another message from Drew Levine saying he thinks we need case studies that quantify the qualitative aspects of green building. Right now, it's mostly anecdotal. So yeah, couldn't agree more. We also have, the chat is firing up. Sarah Kudra, she says, we're currently fighting to not value engineer balconies out of the affordable condo project. Even in the midst of this pandemic, owners can be short-sighted about the value of outdoor space for units, parentheses, which is so much more than the dollar itemized on the GC's valued engineered list. Yeah, good, fair point. I just want to continue with this other message that was submitted by Catherine Elmore again. This is for Angelina. I don't think there's that much tension between the human people-focused perspective of the bottom line. Mitigation funding can save the nation $6 in future disaster costs for every $1 spent on hazard mitigation. And she provided a link to the National Institute of Building Science. Fair point.
I feel like those two comments are really connected, and one of the things that was very interesting for me in developing the cultural resilience criterion was how much the people who were developers on that advisory team kept helping us to articulate why is this, like, what's the financial case, like what is going to make a developer who's not worrying about these values say okay. And it's like low turnover, high occupancy rates, very fast lease up, all of these things that help people with their bottom line are actually enabled by what we're talking about. But often what's missing is connecting that dot and those dots and really making that clear and continuing to sort of affirm that that is true.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. There are these qualitative aspects of things that Drew mentioned that, but we have to be able to connect it to the financial aspect of things, which we can do. We just have to connect those dots sometimes for them. But I love the idea of utilizing stories so that more folks have that aha moment for themselves too. So that's really important.
So we've got roughly 5 minutes left before the top of the hour. Unless there's any more questions that folks, attendees would like to submit, I'd like to just give the panelists a virtual round for your time and thoughts today. I've certainly learned a lot. Also, thank you to the Green Building United and Illinois Green for the opportunity for all of us to be part of this and for allowing us to close out the conference in a more people-focused minded way, which I think all of us here in this panel, we were all about. We've talked about a lot of things today, and I think that one thing that I've learned is that our country's recovery from both a pandemic and social justice standpoint or perspective really depends on our ability to keep people in their homes and stretch the dollars further to build and preserve more affordable housing. And our panelists talked all about that today. To wrap up, I'd like to just leave all of you with a final question, and as we wrap up the 2020 National Gravity Housing Conference, and that is, maybe think on this a little bit further. What have you learned today that you'll take away and prioritize more in your work or personal life? Either something new or something that you're going to prioritize differently. I think that that's something that all of us are already thinking about, given recent events, but how can we bring our work into this? So with that, I'd love to just pass it on to Liz. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maria, Nella, Angelina, and Lauren. That was wonderful and an awesome way to close out our last education session of the day. I think it gives us definitely a lot of inspiration to be going into our final, as we close out the conference here. But also just thank you guys for participating. And also a big thank you again to our sponsors for all of their generous support in making this conference possible.